Secret of Platform 13, Chapter 8. It was incredible how helpful everyone was. Witches who worked in school kitchens, trying to make 2 pounds of mince go round 100 children, said they would come, and so did wizards who taught chemistry and stayed behind to make interesting explosions after the children had gone home. An animal trainer who trained birds for films and television and was really an enchanter promised to bring his flock of white doves so that the evening could begin with a fly past. Melisande, the water nymph who was not a mermaid, swam through the outlet pipe at Fortlands and spoke to her uncle, who was a merrow and worked the sewers, dredging up stuff which people had flushed down the loo by mistake or lost in the plug hole of the bath, and he too said he would come and do a trick for Raymond. Really, people are so kind, said Gertie as she ran about, jollying along the tree spirits who had agreed to do a special dance for Raymond on the night. And she was right. After all, it wasn't as though they didn't know what Raymond was like. That kind of thing gets around. But everyone wanted the king and queen to be happy. The island mattered to them. It was their homeland, even if they themselves hadn't been there, and there seemed to be no end to the trouble they were prepared to take. The ghosts, during these 2 days, were everywhere, helping, persuading, taking messages. Even Miriam Hughes stopped apologising and found a ladies' group of banshees, those pale, ghastly women who wail and screech when something awful is going to happen. And they agreed to come and sing sad songs for the prince. A troll called Henry, who lived in the basement of the Bank of England, said he thought he could message some shape-shifting, and Hans tried to forget the hurt that Raymond had done him by calling him creepy, and practiced weightlifting till his muscles threatened to crack. As for Odge Gribble, she went off by herself in the underground to visit an aunt of her mother's. The aunt was an old woman of gloominess and absolutely marvellous at turning people bold, and she promised to bring some friends along from her sewing circle and to amuse Raymond by making donkeys' tails come out of people's foreheads and that kind of thing. But it was Cor who worked himself hardest. Hour after hour, he sat by the lake with his black book, practicing his monster-raising spell. He didn't eat, he scarcely slept, but he wouldn't stop. There was something special about the monster of the Serpentine, only he couldn't remember what it was. There was a lot he couldn't remember these days, but he wasn't going to give up. There was nothing Cor wouldn't have done to bring back the prince, unboxed and unsacked, to the parents who wanted him so much. The only thing that still worried the rescuers was how to make Raymond Trottle come to the park. Of course, it would be easy to call him by magic, as Cor had called the ghosts, but they had promised faithfully not to use any magic directly on the prince. It was Ben who thought of what to do. There's a boy at Raymond's school called Paul, who's the son of a duke. Raymond would do anything to keep up with him. If we pretend that Paul's giving a secret party by the lake, I'm sure Raymond will come. Then his face became troubled. Of course, it's cheating, I suppose, it's a lie. But Cor was firm about this. Bringing Raymond back to the island is like a military campaign, like a war. In a war, a soldier might have to tell a lie, but he'd still be serving his country. Ben's plan worked. Melisande knew a siren who worked in Fortlands showing off the dresses, and she borrowed a posh invitation card, and Ben pretended that Paul had bribed him to deliver it. And just before 12 o'clock on Midsummer's Eve, Raymond Trottle, in his jazziest clothes, arrived at the edge of the lake and found a great throne which the trolls had built for him, and a host of people who raised their arms and hailed him as a prince. A prince, said Raymond. Me? Yes, your highness, said the wizard, and told Raymond the story of his birth. Raymond listened, and as he did, a smug, self-satisfied smile spread across his face. I always knew I was special, he said. I knew it, and he climbed onto the throne. There had been nothing like it for 100 years. The witches had made a circle of protection around the lake, which no one could cross. Everything inside it was invisible to any stray wanderers. Light came from the flaring torches of the wizards and from the glowworms which Gertie had coaxed into the trees, hundreds of them, glimmering and winking like stars. And there were real stars too. The night was clear. The moon shone down calmly. Doesn't it look beautiful, whispered Ben. He hadn't expected to be allowed to watch, but Odge had told him not to be so silly. Of course you're watching. We'll hide in the shrubbery with the mistmaker. No one will notice you being there. And they didn't. It was strange how Ben fitted in. He spoke to the ghosts as easily as the islanders, and even Odgisal, the old woman of gloominess, and had patted him on the head without turning him the least bit bold. The Raymond Trottle magic show began, with a fly past of important birds. First a skin of geese flew in perfect formation across the moon, dipping their wings in salute as they passed over the prince. Next, the enchanter who had brought them called up a cloud of coal-black ravens who swooped and circled over Raymond's head. And then he stretched out an arm, and from a tall tree full of nightingales came music so glorious that then and Odge vanished for a moment as the mistmaker folded his paws over his chest and sighed. Last came 3 dozen snow-white doves, which did the most amazing aerial acrobatics and turned to green, to orange, to pink as the wizards changed the light in the flares. Then one bird left the flock, pulled a sprig of greenery from a laurel bush, flew with it in his beak to Raymond's throne, and laid it in his lap. It was just like this that the dove in the ark had come to Noah and showed him about his troubles, and all the watchers were very much moved. And what did Raymond Trottle say? He said, "I've seen that before on telly." But now the waters of the lake began to shimmer and shine. Then slowly, very slowly, 3 spouts of water rose from the centre, and on the top each spout sat a beautiful girl who began to sing and comb her hair. Of course, there was a far more mermaids than this on the island, Your Highness, said Cor, who was standing beside the prince. Not only more, but of better quality, thought the wizard, who was beginning to realise that Ernie had meant when he'd said magic wasn't what it was. Once the mermaids came from the swimming baths and the chlorine in the water hadn't done much for their voices. The second had cut her hair into spikes after a pop group came to give an open-air concert by the lake where she lived. So though she could sing, she couldn't really comb her hair. And as for the third, she was Melisande from the Fountain of Fortlands, and as she sang and combed, she kept pointing to her feet. No one knew why she minded so much about being taken for a mermaid, but she did. Everyone clapped when it was over, though Raymond didn't seem very excited. And then Melissande's uncle, whom they called the Plodger, came forward. He was wearing his wellies and the woolly hat he wore to work in the sewers, but he bowed very respectfully to the prince and said, "I shall search for the treasure of the lake." He then walked to the water's edge, plunged into the shallows, kept on till the water came to his waist, his chin, his woolly hat, and disappeared. No one was worried about this because merrows can breathe under the water, but they were very interesting. The Plodger was gone a long time, and when he came back he was holding a large fish by the tail. The fish was flopping and wriggling, and the Plodger, though covered in slime and waterweed, looked pleased. The wizards and witches whispered among themselves because they knew what was coming. And in the bushes, Odge said, "This is going to be good. He's found a special carp." The Plodger came right up to Raymond. He still had the fish upside down, and the fish went on wriggling and thrashing its tail. Then suddenly, it gave a big hiccup, and out of its mouth came a beautiful ring. Swallowing rings is something certain fish do. One can read about it in fairy tales, but finding a fish who has done it when you're wandering about at the bottom of a grey and murky lake is really difficult, and from the watchers there came another burst of clapping. The Plodger then thanked the fish and threw him back into the lake, and Raymond looked at the ring. "It isn't gold," he said. "It isn't a proper one. You couldn't get money for it in a shop." Cor shook his head, and the merrow went off looking hurt. It was true that the ring had come out of a Christmas cracker, but what had that to do with anything? The special fish had trusted him. He had given up the ring that had been in his stomach for 10 years, the ring that was part of his life as a fish. And all the prince wanted to know was, could he sell it in the shop? After that came the chorus of banshees. They had a busy week wailing in a football stadium because they knew that England was going to lose the European Championship. But they'd taken a lot of trouble putting on their white shrouds and looking properly sinister and sad. And the songs were sinister and sad too. Songs about darkness and dread and doom and decay. When the banshees had finished, Raymond wanted to know if they were going to be sawn in half. "There's always people sawn in half when there's a magic on the telly," he said. Needless to say, the banshees didn't stay around after that, and Hans came on to do some weightlifting. Yoga had washed off the fern seed and looked truly splendid in his leather shorts and his embroidered braces and the knee socks with the tassel on the side. First he picked up a park bench, twirled it over his head and put it down. Then he plucked out a concrete drinking fountain, balanced it on his nose and put it back. and then he turned to the statue of Alderman, Sir Harold Henfitter, which had been put up a month before. The older man was cast in bronze and rested on a slab of marble, and even Hans had to pull and tug several times before he could free it from the ground. But he did. Then he counted to 1, to 2, to 3, and threw the 10-ton alderman into the air. Everyone waited. They waited and waited, but nothing happened. Nothing ever would happen, and that was the point, of course. The alderman had been thrown with such force that he would never come down again. Even now, Sir Harold Henfitter is going round and round somewhere in space, and will go on doing so until the end of time. It is not easy to believe that Raymond did after this amazing trick. He pointed with his fat finger at the giant's midriff. He giggled, and then he said, "Buttons come off his braces." No one could believe their ears. Making personal remarks is rude at any time, but at a moment like this, it was true there had been a slight twang as the bottom went missing, but it was only on one side of the ogre's leather shorts and hardly slipped at all. Still, the show had to go on. The wizards did some tricks with the weather, making it rain on one side of the lake and snow on the other, and calling up a rumble of thunder with lightning following afterwards, and then it was time for refreshments. Gertie was in charge of these, and instead of arranging for an ice cream lady to come with her tray, she had laid on something very special. She ran to the big elm growing by the water and called to the glowworms to come so that the tree was lit as brightly as on the stage. Then she tapped the bark and spoke softly to the tree, and lo, every one of its branches began to bear fruit. There were peaches like golden moons, apples whose red skins glistened, pears as big as 2 fists put together. "We beg your highness to refresh himself," said Gertie. Raymond got out of his throne and waddled over to the tree, and then he said, "I don't like fruit. It's got pips in it. I want a gobstopper." Everyone lost heart a little after that. Cor didn't know what a gobstopper was. They hadn't had them when he lived up here, and even when the troll called Henry drew one for him, he didn't feel like conjuring one up. There is very little magic done with gobstoppers anywhere in the world, and in the end, a kind of witch who worked as a school cook got on her bicycle and found an all-light garage which sold sweets and brought one for Raymond, who sucked it, moving it from cheek to bulging cheek all through the second part of the show.